Hello everyone, I'm Alex. Today we will explore the mysterious case of a little girl who disappeared from her bedroom in the middle of the night. As the police investigate, they are drawn into strange, unexpected events that no one could have predicted. Eventually, the detectives discover the truth about the little girl's fate, but no one can prepare for what they are about to face. Rowan Ford was born in San Diego, California on April 11, 1998. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother, Colleen, took her daughter to live in a small town called Stella, Missouri. Here, Colleen met and married a man named David. Before meeting David, she already had a child from a previous marriage, and after the wedding, she and her new husband had a baby girl. Rowan grew up in a large family with 2 sisters and 2 brothers. They had a very close relationship. Rowan was an outdoorsy girl. She rode her bike around town, enjoyed swimming, and spent much time pursuing her passion for painting. She also attended Sunday school at her local church, where she was always willing to help children struggling with their studies. But in November 2007, when Rowan was only 9 years old, something terrible happened. Rowan Ford was in the 4th grade at a local elementary school. Her mother worked the night shift at a store while her stepfather spent most of the day working on the farm. As a result, Rowan often had to fend for herself, which made her very independent. On November 2nd, as usual, Rowan was home alone. Her mother left for work, and her stepfather had not yet returned from the farm. The following day, around 9 o'clock, Colleen finished her night shift and returned home. When she checked her daughter's room, she found that Rowan was not there. Sensing something was wrong, Colleen immediately asked her husband about her daughter. David calmly replied that the night before, Rowan had asked if she could stay overnight at a friend's house, and he had agreed without asking the friend's name. Since the town was small and peaceful, he didn't think there was anything to worry about. However, Colleen began to worry. She immediately contacted all of Rowan's friends, but none of them had seen her, and she did not stay overnight at anyone's house. Colleen's anxiety grew. She wandered around town looking for her daughter, but all her efforts were in vain. When she returned home, she told David that Rowan had disappeared. Colleen wanted to call the police immediately, but David reassured her that Rowan had probably just gone somewhere and would be home soon. The waiting time passed in tension. When she could no longer bear it, Colleen decided to call 911 herself to report her daughter missing. Soon after, the local sheriff organized an emergency search. He went to Colleen's house to question David, as he was the last person to see Rowan before she disappeared. David said he had been working on the farm the night before with his co-worker Christopher. Then a mutual friend of theirs named Nathan stopped by. The 3 decided to drink and play pool at David's house. On the way home, they stopped at the liquor store and returned to the house together. There they stayed for several hours that night. Christopher asked Nathan to drive him home to the neighboring town where his trailer was, and they convinced David to join them to continue the fun before leaving the house. He checked on Rowan in her room and found her asleep. David left with his friends. They stopped by the shop again, got more alcohol, and went to Christopher's trailer, where they continued drinking for about an hour. David decided to go home and asked Nathan to drive him. Nathan agreed, but chose to take a detour instead of the main highway. He was pretty drunk by then and didn't want to risk the police, so Nathan dropped him off and drove home. While David went straight to bed after being woken up by Rowan, who asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house without much thought, he agreed and fell asleep. The police approached this story with a bit of skepticism. Which confused them the most was the fact that a 9-year-old girl decided to go to her friend's house in the middle of the night, and her stepfather let her go without even asking which friend she was talking about. The police chief suggested that David might be hiding something or was directly involved with Rowan. Missing, but he had no evidence to support this theory. The police searched the town and surrounding area until late at night. The locals immediately joined in the search, as they all knew the Rowan family and wanted to help. The population of Stella was only around 150, so news of her disappearance spread throughout the county. Almost immediately, people were used to being able to let their children play outside without worrying, as nothing happened in such a quiet place. But now, when Rowan disappeared without a trace and the police could not find her for an entire day, the residents of Stella were in a state of panic. The first day of the search yielded no results. The 4th of November, the police went to the neighboring town to speak to Christopher, who confirmed David's story in full. However, Christopher added that his friend had not even contacted him since that evening, and he had only just found out about Rowan's disappearance the same day the police expanded the search and brought in more volunteers, but they still couldn't find Rowan or any clues about her whereabouts. The following day, the FBI joined the investigation while local police continued to search for Rowan all over town. And the surrounding area, the detectives focused on exploring the possibility of a kidnapping. They were very skeptical of the stepfather's story, as it seemed very suspicious. The police also checked with all of Rowan's friends and confirmed that she had not visited any of them that night. The investigators continued to talk to David, and he changed some details in his story several times, raising further suspicions against him. For example, he gave conflicting timelines for his absence that night, and even said that perhaps Rowan had not asked his permission to go to her friend's house and just left without him knowing. The FBI agents also discovered that on the night of her disappearance, David had borrowed his mother's car that night, a fact he had not initially disclosed to the police. Investigators seized the car and David's pickup truck for examination when they discovered this. However, experts found no evidence of any involvement. Undeterred, the detectives decided to re-interview Christopher and Nathan, who had been with David that evening. Christopher was brought to the police station for questioning. He told the same story before and even agreed to take a lie detector test. The results showed that he was not lying. A few hours after leaving the station and returning to work, Christopher happened to see Chief Clark's car and signaled him to stop. Chief Clark was the chief of police in the neighboring town of Whitten. He had known Christopher since he was a child, as he was friends with Christopher's adoptive parents. Over the years, Christopher had respected Clark and often sought his advice, especially during difficult times, such as the death of his adoptive mother. Although he was not directly involved in the investigation, the Stella Police Department handled the case. Chief Clark had kept an eye on the case. While talking to Christopher, he noticed something strange about his behavior. Clark had a hunch that Christopher might be hiding something. Realizing that Rowan's fate was still unknown, Clark decided to share his suspicions with the FBI. FBI agents also began to theorize that Christopher might be withholding vital information about Rowan's stepfather. David might have asked Christopher to hide the truth or change some details about that night's story. Christopher may have feared that if he had told the truth, he would have been considered an accomplice. Chief Clark believed his close relationship with Christopher might help convince him to cooperate. He asked to speak to Christopher in person to encourage him to reveal what he knew. That evening, Christopher went to Colleen's house to ask about the progress of the search. Coincidentally, FBI agents arrived simultaneously to meet with Rowan's mother. When they saw Christopher, they decided to ask some more questions. Christopher continued to insist that the events of that evening unfolded precisely as he had previously described. However, for the first time, he admitted that he could not completely rule out the possibility that David was involved in Rowan's disappearance. Christopher also expressed his desire to help the police solve the case, no matter how devastating the truth. He even offered to bring a recording device to secretly talk to David, hoping to get him to confess. However, at that point, the detectives decided not to use this tactic. Instead, they asked Christopher if he knew of any locations where David might have hidden Rowan's body. Christopher listed several suspicious locations. The following day, the police immediately searched these locations while expanding the investigation to the Stella area. At the same time, the FBI continued to summon David for questioning, but he continued to deny any involvement. Detectives searched David's home for further clues, but again, they found no evidence. Meanwhile, Christopher goes to Sheriff Clark's office to discuss his recent meeting with the FBI. During the conversation, Clark becomes increasingly sure Christopher hides something important. After the meeting, Clark immediately contacts the detectives and informs them that Christopher may be holding some information that could help prove David's involvement in Rowan's disappearance. The FBI agents believe that Christopher genuinely wants to share something, but for some reason, he is hesitant. They ask Sheriff Clark to continue trying to convince Christopher to cooperate, given that he has repeatedly contacted Clark to discuss the case. The next day, November 7th, The police summoned Christopher back to the station. They need his consent to search the safe that he left at David's house while he was living there. Christopher had previously stayed at David's home for several months when he did not have his place to live, and some of his personal belongings were still there. Christopher agreed to let the police search the safe and let them search his trailer and car. He also voluntarily provided a DNA sample and agreed to be questioned again. During the questioning, the police asked Christopher to confirm David's story about that evening. But this time, he unexpectedly admitted that David's story was inaccurate. The investigators immediately pressured him to reveal the truth. However, the pressure was too much, and Christopher became stressed and agitated. He reacted violently, stating that if the police continued to treat him as a suspect and tried to charge him, he would no longer cooperate. The questioning was forced to stop, and Christopher left the police station. That evening, he went to see Chief Clark, complaining that the detectives treated him like a criminal. He even mentioned that he might hire a lawyer. Clark said that was his right, but also emphasized that the police were trying to find Rowan. In response, Christopher said he would not talk to anyone other than Clark. Seeing an opportunity to persuade Christopher to confess, the chief continued to speak to him. Gradually, Christopher became emotional, even crying. He asserted that he had always loved Rowan and would never hurt her. While living at David's house, Christopher developed a close relationship with Rowan and her siblings. The children considered him a family member and often called him Uncle Christopher. Clark sensed that Christopher was about to reveal everything. However, someone entered the office at that moment, momentarily distracting Clark. When he returned, Christopher had left without saying anything more. The sheriff immediately contacted the FBI, reporting the conversation. He believed Christopher was ready to confess, but if pressed too hard, he might remain silent and hire a lawyer. Clark offered to give Christopher more time to think, and the detectives agreed. Meanwhile, the search for Rowan continued, but to no avail. Things changed on November 9th, a week after she disappeared. The search party expanded its scope and reached a remote area near Powell, about 10 miles from Stella. Amid the desolate fields and dense trees, they discovered a large hole in the ground. When they examined the area, they were horrified to find Rowan's body. Her body was hidden under leaves and debris scattered around. She was missing from the waist down, except for one sock. An autopsy confirmed that Rowan had been strangled and had signs of sexual assault. Immediately after the body was discovered, the FBI contacted Sheriff Clark. They asked him to continue talking to Christopher, hoping he would reveal the whole truth. Chief Clark received word that Christopher had come to the police station early that morning when he was not there. He appeared highly nervous and informed the officers that he needed to see Clark immediately. Sensing that something was wrong, Clark immediately set out to find Christopher. He searched everywhere he could have been, but found no trace of him. Things remained deadlocked until Christopher himself called Clark. His voice was filled with panic. The first thing he asked was if he was being followed. Christopher explained that after hearing that Rowan's body had been found, he felt highly stressed. To calm himself down, he drove around town. However, while driving, he noticed a gray car following him. This made him panic, worried that someone was following or threatening him. Clark reassured Christopher that he knew nothing about any surveillance activities on him. He then asked me to meet him in person to talk. When they met, Christopher was highly nervous. He expressed his fear for his safety, worried that now that Rowan's body had been found, the police might charge him with murder. Not only that, he was also concerned that someone out there might seek revenge on him. Seeing this, Clark decided to take Christopher to the police station for safety. He told Christopher seriously that the case had now been officially classified as a murder, and it was time for him to reveal the whole truth. Christopher started to cry again. The police chief looked straight at him and asked him to tell him what David had done to Rowan. However, Christopher hesitated and shook his head. He said there were too many people in the police station, and he did not want to discuss the case here. Christopher suggested finding a quieter place to talk and mentioned a small bridge a few miles from town. Sheriff Clark agreed, and the two drove there. As they got out of the car, Christopher suddenly held out his hands to Clark and said that he should handcuff him. Clark was surprised by this action and replied that it was unnecessary. But Christopher shook his head and said, "After what I'm about to tell you, you'll have to." Then he began to speak. At first, Christopher repeated the story he had told the police many times. That night, Nathan and David had gone to his trailer to drink. After a while, Nathan and David decide to go home. David asks Nathan to drive them, and they detour to avoid the police. But then Christopher began to reveal a truth that stunned Sheriff Clark. He confessed that he had intended to assault Rowan from the beginning sexually and quickly formulated a plan. Knowing Nathan and David would spend time on the road around the fields, Christopher took advantage of the opportunity. He jumped into his car and drove straight to David's house on the main highway. When he arrived, Christopher snuck into Rowan's room, picked her up, and carried her to the car without waking her. He then took her to his trailer, where he committed the brutal act. Only then did Rowan wake up and struggle, but she was too weak to escape. During the process, Christopher did not turn on the lights or say a word, because he did not want Rowan to recognize him. He had initially intended to take her home immediately after committing the depraved act. But when he carried Rowan out of the trailer, the bright moonlight made his face clear to her. Terrified of being recognized, Christopher quickly grabbed a rope and strangled Rowan to death. After committing the crime, he put her body in the car and began to think about his next move. Christopher initially planned to throw Rowan's body from the bridge where he and Clark were standing, but he realized that if he did, the body would be discovered soon. Confused, he drove around the county, trying to find a suitable place to hide the body. Eventually, he remembered a large pit near the neighboring town of Powell and decided to head there. In this remote area, he dumped Rowan's body in the pit, attempting to cover it with leaves and branches. But because the pit was so large, everything he covered quickly fell into the pit. Knowing that he could not completely hide the body, Christopher left the scene and returned to his trailer. When he returned, he found Rowan's blood on his clothes and mattress. Realizing that he needed to cover his tracks, he collected the bloody clothes, bedding, and rope used to kill Rowan. He also took her underwear, all of which he put in a large barrel intending to burn. But then Christopher realized that a big fire would attract attention. So instead of burning it outside, he dragged the barrel into the shed, closed the door, and started a fire inside. Sheriff Clark was speechless after hearing the confession. All this time, he had believed that David was the culprit and that Christopher was covering up information. It was hard to accept that the man he had known for nearly 20 years could be such a brutal man. What shocked Clark even more was that Christopher had 3 young children, although he had not lived with them since the divorce. He had always appeared to be a gentleman, but now his true face was much colder and crueler. After telling the whole story of his crimes, Christopher agreed to go to the police station voluntarily. Sheriff Clark did not immediately handcuff him. Only when he arrived, after Christopher repeated his confession to the FBI agents, was he officially arrested for murder. Christopher also signed a consent form allowing the police to search his trailer and car. At the end of his confession, he said he regretted what he had done and claimed that he cried like a baby all day long. Shortly thereafter, detectives visited David and informed him that Christopher had confessed to the murder. Based on his strange behavior and inconsistent statements, the police began to suspect that David may have known about the murder and was deliberately covering up for his friend. However, the case took an even more shocking turn. David changed his story completely when he was brought into the interrogation room. According to him, on the night Rowan went missing when he returned home and did not find her in her room, he immediately suspected that Christopher might have kidnapped her. So he took his mother's car and drove straight to Christopher's trailer. When he got inside, he saw Christopher crouching beside Rowan on the bed. But instead of saving her, David decided to join in the crime. He admitted that he also sexually assaulted Rowan and then killed her with Christopher, dumping her body to get rid of the evidence. David claimed that his mind was completely numb during the process, as if he was disconnected from reality. He claimed that he could not remember what had happened for several days after the incident. This statement completely stunned the detectives. They immediately went back to interrogate Christopher to verify. However, Christopher insisted that David had nothing to do with the crime and that everything happened exactly as he had said. The inconsistencies between the two accounts baffled the police, but they had reason to believe that Christopher's story was closer to the truth. Medical experts confirmed that the victim had been strangled with a thin rope, a detail that only the real killer would know. When they searched Christopher's trailer, they found a container of ashes containing hairs that matched Rowan's. Although it was unclear whose version of events was accurate, both men gave incriminating statements to each other. David was arrested, and the case was formally set for trial. During the trial, Christopher attempted to remove all his statements from the case file. He claimed that he was unaware that his confessions could be used against him and accused the police of violating his rights. However, the judge rejected this request because all conversations between him and the police were voluntary. Christopher also sought to mitigate his sentence by citing his troubled past. He had been moved back and forth between his biological and foster parents as a child, which had a profound impact on his mental health and development. He even called a psychologist to testify, who confirmed that Christopher showed signs of developmental problems. But in the end, none helped him escape the harsh sentence. In 2012, 5 years after Rowan's murder, Christopher was sentenced to death. Despite several appeals, all his efforts were in vain. Meanwhile, David's situation became much more complicated. He confessed to attacking and killing Rowan, but his testimony completely contradicted what Christopher had previously said. This put the prosecution in a difficult position. If they charged David with murder, there was a chance that Christopher's sentence would be overturned or reduced, and David could escape because there was insufficient physical evidence against him, such as DNA. Although the prosecution did not rule out the possibility that David was an accomplice to Christopher, they did not have direct evidence to prove this theory. In the end, to ensure that Christopher's death sentence would not be overturned, the prosecution was forced to make a controversial decision: reduce the charges against David. He was charged with only 2 counts: child endangerment and obstruction of justice. As a result, David received an 11-year prison sentence with a minimum of 5 years. David's sentence caused a wave of public outrage. If he was indeed involved in the murder, then an 11-year prison sentence is considered too light for the brutality of the crime. However, due to the lack of solid evidence, nothing more can be done. Moreover, the possibility of him being retried is almost zero. As for Christopher, he is still in prison awaiting execution. However, in the U.S., the process from the death penalty to execution usually takes decades. Therefore, there is no guarantee that his death sentence will be carried out. Most likely, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. This story is truly shocking and leaves many unanswered questions. What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the following stories. Thank you for watching.